Good afternoon and welcome to Have We Got Planning News for You. Thank you very much indeed for joining us once again. Welcome as always to our YouTube viewers. Please don't forget to subscribe to our channel. And please, of course, consider making a charity donation. In place of registration fee, we support NHS charities together and shelter. But if you'd rather donate to a charity of your choice, that would be equally great. Now, the big news in the planning week, apart from, of course, our dress, or at least Mary's and mine, is of course the inclusion of a planning bill in the Queen's speech. We still don't have really any details beyond what was in the white paper, but what is clear is that following the public consultation, the government's decided to press on with, amongst other things, a new local plan regime that does away with the existing local authorities' duty to cooperate. Now, what does this mean for strategic planning? Do we need strategic planning? Do we need some regional direction to make the system work? Well, who better to help us through these issues than the strategic planning supremo, Catriona Riddell, one of the best-known leading experts on this subject. Catriona, welcome. Can you tell us where you're calling from? What theme have you chosen to justify Mary and me dressing as we are? And what are you drinking this evening?
I am sitting in a little village. Lots of people would say it's a suburb, but I call it a village of Thames Ditton in Surrey. And we've got some interesting neighbours around here, including Dominic Rabb lives just down the road from me. I am choosing tonight, and I think that the theme's fairly obviously from a background, but I've got a little bit of a hand as well. For those that know me, I like a little bit of 80s pop, so we'll have a little bit of an 80s theme, hopefully. Hopefully we'll have some music as well, some 80s music rather than the rubbish you played at the start.
Oh, we're trying to get Brian May on the show, actually. Well, I say trying to get Brian May, more than I probably revealed more than I should have done there. We had a seriously almost heated discussion on WhatsApp last night about whether you'd have said 80s pop or 80s rock. And I think Chris was desperate to turn up in some spandex or something like that. But we'll leave that to the imagination. And what are you drinking, Catriona?
I am drinking a little bit of Scottish Harris gin, and these bottles are very nice lights afterwards. They make very nice lights, and I'm drinking it from my I Love the 80s mug.
Amazing.
So, not very classy, I'm afraid. It should be in a nice gin glass, but it suits the theme.
Fantastic. Well, welcome, and we're really looking forward to our discussion. Chris is going to lead the discussion with you in the second half of the show. Please, dear viewers, do post any questions you'd like us to pose in the Q&A. I think there's at least a couple already. And of course, Catriona, if there's anything that we're discussing, I think our cases about travellers and caravan parks probably don't raise any strategic planning issues, but if there's anything of interest, do chip in before the discussion. Now, Mary, how are you?
I'm very well.
Your Jean-Michel Jarre hat.
I'm wearing my Jean-Michel Jarre hat. I have got my Depeche Mode
amazing
T-shirt on. I've got some albums here, but the one I really like is the Steve Miller Band. Do you remember? Abracadabra. Gonna reach out and grab you. So sorry.
I was wearing nappies back then.
Stop showing off. Stop showing off. So anyway, Mary Cook, Town Legal. I am in Bristol. I'm in a lovely office building in Bristol owned by a company called Origin, and I'm doing a planning inquiry with another company called Origin 3. And I have to say a big thank you to Crispin, who has helped Marcus, who's helped me with the get up, doing an inquiry down here. And the thing I've noticed in the news this week is the PINS update following the case, the Hertfordshire case that we discussed last week. PINS issued an update indicating that sadly there will still be no accompanied site visits for a while, no news on in-person events, but at least confirming what we knew to be the case, which is that ruling doesn't apply to inquiries.
Thanks, Mary. Now, Paul, I'm gutted. I got a text from you saying I've been hunting around the house, Raisy's memorabilia, about to go into the attic, into the box which Ursula's labelled Paul's crap, don't open unless divorced.
Oh,
where's your poodle hair?
Live magic.
I love it. Wow.
From Queen 1980, 85, 80, sorry, 86.
86. Nebworth.
In the attics. My wife won't let me put it on the wall. And if we're talking about nonsense, we've got Peter Gabriel's Soul. We've got Marillion, Misplaced Childhood. We've got a bit of Phil Collins down here. We've got a bit of Rainbow, bit of Invisible Touch. We've got the works, bit of Pink Floyd, and tucked up there. Yeah. It's not strictly 80s, but it's just 79. A bit of Bat Out of Hell. And that's in memoriam of the writer. And I'm reading The Hacienda by Peter Hook, How Not to Run a Nightclub. And to be clear, I'm sure that my son, whose band it is that provides the music for the show, won't be offended, because today the Ruby Tuesdays announced their tour dates for later on this year.
Amazing.
The Ruby Tuesday are touring live. Everything else is just window dressing.
Facebook.com/Ruby Tuesdays. Chris, I was expecting to see you in all pink, like in the white show. I'm disappointed.
I've let the side down, haven't I? But I'm impressed by our vinyl collections. I've got vinyl as well. I want you to try and guess the album and the artist. Okay, who is this? Do you know what that is?
Pass.
Look at the guy with long hair.
The
Police. That looks very much like the Police to me.
Oh, yeah. Mary Cook.
Yes.
Simon Ricketts is going to like that. Synchronistic. Hang on, that's not the only one, though. That's not the only one. What is this? This is tricky. What's that one? Anybody recognise that?
Oh, Talking Heads.
No. Good guess.
Not quite like that.
UB40?
Frankie Goes to Hollywood. Okay, this one's easy. Charlie might even get this.
That's Madonna, isn't it?
Like a Virgin.
Last gig I went to. The 15th, 2020.
Oh, absolute classics on there. Okay, very good. Presumption's been listening to my music. He doesn't think very much of it. He's been watching a film. Look at that.
Brilliant, epic.
Isn't that the best film of the 80s? I am drinking in honor of Catriona. I am drinking a drink that makes me think that the world could be a better place and we could have regional planning. But for now, it's just Wonderland. Okay, because that's about as close as it's ever going to get, as far as I could see.
That's a good big country 80s song.
Sorry, say that again.
The good big country 80s song, Wonderland.
Okay. Yes, that's very true. Very good. Very good. I've just finished the third week of my inquiry, and we had Harold Stevens as the inspector. He's just so charming and quite funny and really enjoyable inquiry. And I had a funny thing today. I did a cost hearing in which I was defending my own costs that Secretary of State was refusing to pay in respect of a Section 288 challenge. You'll all know when we do a High Court challenge after we've done an inquiry and the Secretary of State's turned it down, we do most of the work. So, we're doing a lot of the drafting and everything like that. So I was there to defend my own fees, but it went well. So I'm quite pleased, and I'd quite like the Secretary of State to pay soon.
Thanks, Chris. For some reason, my mind is immediately drawn to the Aarhus Convention, the prohibition on prohibitively expensive costs, but I can't think why. Anyway, Charlie Banner here from Keating Chambers. I am wearing my Rolling Stones t-shirt. I know they're 70s rather than 80s, but they are the classic rock band. And I am wearing a leather jacket that I acquired directly from Bon Jovi, the band. It is their Lost Highway tour. It's signed by Tico Torres, David Bryan, the much missed Richie Sambora, and John Bon Jovi himself. Annoyingly, when I bought this, I bought, I'm between medium and large size in the UK. And so I said large on the form, but it's an American large size. And it's absolutely massive.
Charlie Banner, you are never a medium to large on any size.
So it's about twice the size of me. So I'm just going to have to eat a lot of pies in the next 20 years and it might finally fit. So at the moment, it just sits in my cupboard here. I'm going to take it off in a moment. And I'm in Chambers and I'm drinking Heineken Blue, unfortunately, very boringly, because I've got to drive back home this evening. Now, let's get on to the case.
Hang on, you've just forgotten
Sasha.
You missed Sasha.
Sasha.
Yeah, Charlie. This reminds me of when I had the pleasure of leading you. You forgot about me.
Well, apart from when you get to live at the most immortal cross-examination, which is not suitable for before the watershed.
Anyway, lovely to see you all. I'm sorry, I've been legging it from deepest Hampshire to get here, so I'm here. All's well that ends well.
Lovely, jubbly. Great stuff. Well, let's go straight into our first case. Curzon Park. And Mary, you're going to tell us about certificates of alternative development.
Indeed, I am. So let me just, there's a bit of a run up to this, which is an explanation of what a certificate of appropriate alternative development is, a CAD for shorthand, and it's a means of applying to the local planning authority to seek a determination as to what the land could be used for if the compulsory purchase order did not exist. And its purpose is to identify every description of development for which planning permission could reasonably have been expected to have been granted on the valuation date if the land had not been compulsorily purchased. And it's important because when compensation is assessed, it must be assumed that the planning permission for the developments in the CAD certificate were in force at the valuation date or would with certainty be in force at some future date. There were 4 adjoining sites being compulsorily acquired by HS2 for the purposes of constructing the Curzon Street HS2 terminus in Birmingham. 4 different landowners, 4 different valuation dates, and each of them applied for a CAD certificate for mixed-use development, including a PBA, purpose-built student accommodation. Now, in the real world, the cumulative effects of the proposed adjoining developments would have been a material planning consideration. But Birmingham City Council considered each of the CAD applications in isolation. And a preliminary legal issue was taken by the Secretary of State to be determined by the upper tribunal about whether on the application for the CADs, they ought to be taken into account the other CAD applications or grants as if they were planning decisions or material planning considerations. So that was the sort of starting point in the tribunal. And the tribunal agreed with the landowners that the CAD applications were not material planning considerations and that there was no statutory basis for treating them as notional planning applications, as the Secretary of State for Transport had argued. So the Secretary of State for Transport sought and was granted permission to appeal on the basis that this was raising a point of importance on the principle of equivalence, which our eagle-eyed listeners will know is the principle underpinning the CPO code that a landowner should be no worse off and no better off in financial terms after their land has been acquired by compulsory purchase. The Court of Appeal upheld the Lands Chamber decision that applications for or grants of the CADs were not to be treated as notional applications for notional application for planning permission or as material planning considerations. The Court of Appeal departed, however, from the Lands Tribunal's view and agreed with the respondents that it's an inevitable consequence of the cancellation assumption that no CAD applications on other sites could have been made, with the effect that the issue of the CADs on different sites must be entirely disregarded. Now, all of that took quite a while, actually, and the consequence of all of this, so it's taken over a year for the Court of Appeal to rule on this preliminary issue. So those poor old landowners are still waiting for their compensation to be assessed. And I'd like to give a shout out, if I may, to my wonderful fellow partner, Raj Gupta and Paul Arnott at Town Legal, because they acted for the landowners.
Thanks, Mary. Well, on the subject of CADs, Paul, over to you.
What extraordinarily sweet of you, Charlie. I do love you. Right, my case involves a case in Sefton. Sefton against the Secretary of State and Doherty as the interested party. If we can bring the front page up. That's fantastic. This is a case involving a gypsy issue, a traveller's site adjacent to a village called Melling, which is between Maghull and Aintree. And most importantly, Melling was founded in the 6th century AD, it turns out. And in the 1400 years that have occurred since the 6th century AD, there has been one interesting person that's come from Melling. That interesting person is Will Sargent, who was the lead guitarist of Echo and the Bunnyman. There we go.
Very good.
Chap on the left-hand side, consistent with our 1980s theme.
However, the important thing about this case was that the claimant was represented by Piers Riley Smith of Kings, the defendant by Sarah Reid of Kings, and the interested party by Michael Rudd of Kings. So it was a Chambers do. But of course, on this show, we do everything without fear or favour in relation to anybody. We don't advertise at all. There is no advertising in relation to this. So, but the argument was that there was a decision, a refusal of planning permission to put 6 caravans on a field adjacent to the village of Melling. That was refused by the planning authority, who then served 2 enforcement notices. Those enforcement notices were appealed successfully and quashed, and grant of planning permission occurred on the Section 78, which occurred. That was then challenged by Sefton, who argued that when you look at greenbelt issues, this is a site in the greenbelt, that you have to identify each of the material considerations and then give substantial weight to each and every element of greenbelt harm. And then you have to add up all those substantial weights and then see if they're outweighed clearly, including the definitional harm, by the benefits. The court said, oh no, that's not how you do it. It's not mathematical. It's not a forensic examination like that. It's all about the overall judgment. And it's a real irony when I see Sarah Reid acting for the defendant when Piers Riley Smith was her pupil. I know how terrifying that is from the first occasion I was against Mr. Justice Andrew Gilbert, as he ended up. So it's a fairly straightforward case. It's an application of simple principles. And the final throwaway line from His Honour Judge Eyre QC, sitting as a High Court judge, is it's all a matter of planning judgment, as if we didn't know. Thank you, guys.
Thanks, Paul. I'm next up, and I'm going to tell you about a case called Corbett and Cornwall. No, not that Corbett and Cornwall, the one we covered a few months ago about compliance with the plan as a whole, but another case also involving the same Mr. Corbett, as far as I can tell, and the same Cornwall Council, but a different site, a different planning permission, and a different judicial review. This case concerned a planning permission, which was itself small scale and not especially interesting, I suspect, to viewers, a single dwelling and a garage in the grounds of a larger house. But the issue in the JR, whilst narrow, is of wider importance. It concerned the proper interpretation of a development plan policy, policy 2 of the Cornwall local plan, which restricted unallocated development outside the settlement boundaries subject to certain exceptions. And those exceptions included development of previously developed land immediately adjoining the settlement. And it was those words, immediately adjoining the settlement, that were in issue. There was no dispute here that the site was PDL because it was garden land within the curtilage of a dwelling, but outside the built-up area, and by virtue of being outside the built-up area, not subject to the garden grabbing exclusion from PDL. The issue was whether it was immediately adjoining the settlement. And the reason that was an issue was that the site and the settlement were physically separated by a road. And the new house would be separated from the settlement by that road and also a driveway leading to the house. Now, Mr. Corbett said this meant it couldn't be considered to be immediately adjoining because there was that severance. Members of the council disagreed and voted by a majority, 9-5, to grant permission. And Mr. Corbett brought to JR and said that they had misinterpreted the policy. Mrs. Justice Jefford, a former member of Keating Chambers, rejected this claim. Having studied the dictionary definition of the term adjoining, she found that it was a wide enough definition to include concepts of next to or very near, that the word immediately didn't add anything to this, didn't mean it had to be even closer. And therefore, she felt that it was for the local authority to decide as a matter of planning judgment whether the site and the settlement boundary were sufficiently proximate to be immediately adjoining. Now, as I say, the case on its facts, it is really rather localised and not particularly interesting. However, it's of some wider importance because the words immediately adjoining aren't uncommon in planning policy, either in policies such as this, relating to development outside but very close to the settlement boundary, or in other sorts of contexts. And so the judgment is informative of what's meant by adjoining in the planning context. It's also a notably concise, easy to read and user-friendly illustration of the court's current approach to interpreting planning policy. And as such, it's quite a useful, informative read for non-lawyers wanting to get a feel of the court's approach. And I commend it to you for that. So that's it in a nutshell. And now, Sasha, you're going to tell us about the Oakley Residential Park appeal.
I am, and I'm going to also tell you what a caravan is, Charlie. Yes, I came to the planning bar to see the world. I'm doing a caravan park site in Essex. And I won't allow any Essex jokes, being a man of Kent. But no, anyway, what I'm going to talk about is this was a proposal to change 50, sorry, not 50, I apologise, many more, 143 caravans, which had conditions imposed on them, restricting their occupation to holiday use. And there was effectively, this was a proposal to turn those 143 caravans from holiday use into permanent residential occupation for the over 50s. And as we can see, the great Philip Ware, very, very good and experienced inspector, was the inspector in this case. And effectively, he found against the application and the appeal. As you can see from para 3, the appeal was dismissed. And he held, effectively, the context is tilt balance wasn't in play. Secondly, there were quite strong tourism policies in the development plan that sought retention of the units for holiday use. And also he came to the conclusion that the off-site contribution from affordable housing that was offered by Oakley Residential Park was not acceptable. So overall, the key takeaway from that is don't underestimate the power of tourism policies, particularly in the context of holiday caravans. Thank you very much, Charlie.
Thanks, Sash. Now, Chris, over to you to start our interview with Catriona.
Yes, thank you very much, Charlie. Good afternoon, Catriona. I think that everybody probably knows that you are the leading expert on strategic planning and regional planning, but that doesn't come just by accident, does it? Because you were involved in the Southeast Plan and all the progress that made. And then obviously 10 years ago, that all came to an abrupt end. But just remind us, please, the work that you were doing before the wonderful idea that the government had to abolish regional strategies.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, I'm not sure I'm sort of the leading expert as opposed to the sort of last woman standing or last man standing. I think sort of one of the last few strategic planners left. So it's a small field, so it's quite easy to be an expert. Yeah, I mean, my background is all strategic planning. I was in Surrey County Council for 16 years and it ended up leading on the Surrey structure plan. Then they abolished structure plans, so I ended up going to the region, and then they abolished regions. So I decided it was safer to work for myself. And you know, my view was, and interesting, you talk about gypsies and travellers, when strategic planning went in the guise of regional planning, I knew it had to come back at some point. So I spent a couple of years or more working on helping local authorities deal with gypsies and travellers, and also get involved in minerals and waste planning. And a big shout out to all the minerals and waste planners out there. They are the unsung heroes and they always get forgotten about. I don't think there was any mention in the white paper of minerals or waste planning. So yeah, so I've spent a long time trying to bring some form of strategic planning back and working with local authorities who feel the same.
Yeah, well, we've got a question from Martin Milmore, which I'm going to ask you a bit later about minerals, because we don't always cover that, and it's an important issue. Okay, now I haven't met a professional planner who doesn't think that regional planning and strategic planning is anything other than completely necessary. And the entire audience here will believe that it's necessary. The joined up coordinated approach, etc., etc. We don't need convincing. It's others who clearly need convincing. However, what might be said is, look, last year we delivered more homes in this country than we have in the last 30 years. And 20 of those years have obviously been with regional planning. So what would you say to the critics who say, well, we don't need regional planning because we're delivering more houses? That may not be minerals, but certainly delivering a lot more housing now than we have in the past. Why do we need regional planning?
I think that one of the misconceptions of strategic planning, regional planning, and planning generally is that it's all about housing, and strategic planning is so much more than that. And you know, it's the interface between national and local. It's about dealing with some of the really big issues around where growth goes, and that includes housing, but it also includes everything else that's needed around supporting economic growth. It's about the big bits of infrastructure. It's about dealing with some of the big issues around things like climate change as well. So it's about dealing with sustainable growth in all its facets, not just about housing. And I think one of the real disappointments in the current system is it has become just so much about housing. And you look at the communities, the new communities that are being prepared is a really good example. Yes, it's ticked the box in terms of numbers, but we're ending up with a whole load of new communities of about 2,000 or 3,000 size in the middle of nowhere, because they're being done at a very, very local level. They're not being done on that sort of strategic spatial scale. So, and they're not necessarily houses are not necessarily being delivered in the places we need them. You know, you look at the problems around London, the problems around Birmingham. So yeah, the numbers might stack up, but that's not good planning. And strategic planning is an essential bit of good planning.
What does it do? What does it deliver that not proceeding with strategic planning? You know, in other words, how does it deliver benefits, tangible benefits?
It delivers, well, apart from just looking at the sort of the wider things that go with good placemaking. So it's about delivering, making sure that growth and the sort of the economy is looked at in a holistic way. It's about joining up communities as much as individual communities. One of the big challenges we've got is in two-tier areas, which still cover most of the country, most of England.
So county and district.
So county and district, and in some areas we've got unitaries in the mix in this sort of spatial geography as well. And they've all got very different roles. So strategic planning has always been a way of making sure that all the functions that counties do, particularly around infrastructure and transport, are joined up with what the districts do in terms of their planning role. So it gives you just that bigger spatial canvas, and I think that's really important. Instead of districts, quite often small districts, looking to accommodate quite a lot of growth in a very small area, it gives you that sort of broader spatial picture to look at different options and look at where the best place is, not the only place to deliver housing and growth.
Yeah, I mean, I have to say, you mentioned Birmingham there. You know, Birmingham without a regional strategy is Birmingham's unmet need, which they used to have in the 1960s and 70s. I grew up in a new town as a product of Birmingham Overspill, as they called it. Now we don't have a regional strategy, so we have Birmingham's unmet need for 40,000, but nothing's been done about it, and nothing's been done about it for years. So without that, I am talking about housing, obviously, but without that, you just don't have any coordinated approach, and it's being passed around. And another one, I mean, I acted for a consortium of 10 house builders and developers in the west of England, and the west of England grasped this is the Bristol area, the greater Bristol area, Somerset, South Gloucestershire. They grasped the nettle. They went ahead with a strategic plan, and all eyes were on Bristol to see if that would work, and it failed. So, I mean, why do they fail? Why not everywhere? We're going to come on to some success stories, but why is this failing to work? And of course, we are not calling it regional planning. We wouldn't dream of doing that, would we?
Yeah, I mean, you're right. West of England authorities were really progressive. They were trying to do something that gave a better outcome. I think the problem is, and the two fundamental problems. One is we're trying to squeeze the strategic planning system into a local planning system that's not fit for purpose. You know, the testing process and everything else is about the first 10 years, deliverability, hitting the housing numbers. It's not about long-term visions and all that goes with that, and transforming areas, which is what the West of England was trying to do. I think that they failed, apart from some sustainability issues. I think fundamentally they failed because it was seen as stitching four local plans together and not one big planning area, and trying to look at different options across that planning area. Greater Exeter failed because of the other reason that this is not working, and I'll come to that every time in a question. It's about the decision making, you know, whether it's sort of spatial development strategies prepared by combined authorities or joint strategic plans. There's not one single decision making body, so every time you have to make a decision on the plan, it has to go back through every single one of the individual authorities to get sign off. And Greater Exeter joint plan failed because one of them at the last minute decided they didn't like what was happening, and then it all fell apart. So unless we sort that issue out and the governance and have one single accountable body for strategic planning and making these big decisions in the interest of the greater good, then, you know, the system's not fit for purpose.
I agree. I couldn't agree with you more that it's trying to do something at a strategic level without the infrastructure in place. And we had a chat yesterday, and I was really interested in your observation. You're very embedded in this system. You know the people, and your observation was a lot of the civil servants who worked on regional planning in the regional offices and in London, they've all gone. They've all gone because their job finished. And so we don't have the government structure to support regional and strategic planning, which was the point you were making yesterday. I think that's right, isn't it? They have largely just left their desks, and there's nobody to do that.
Yeah, and if you don't have the understanding at a sort of central government level, then it's really hard to get across to central government how important strategic planning is. And I think it's become also a much bigger issue because you've got so many different departments effectively dealing with strategic planning issues, but not in an integrated way. And I think the other disconnect is the way that the government agencies work as well, Highways England. So if an authority goes forward with a really good plan, they think they've got it all sorted, they get to an examination, and Highways England or Network Rail or whatever environment agency say, no, we don't like it, and it all falls apart. So until we get much better understanding at the government level about what good strategic planning looks like, we won't get a good strategic planning system.
Yeah, well, we're moving around the country, aren't we? Let's move to Greater Manchester. And, the 10 became 9 as Stockport bailed out. And that has been a very slow moving story. It is. So I've been advising Peel, who have a lot of skin in that game. It's not just you, Paul, that advertises. Just kidding.
Surely not.
And in terms of that, what you can say about what's happened in Greater Manchester, well, at least it's keep going. Well done, Howard Bernstein. Well done, Andy Burnham. But it's so slow. Is that the problem with regional planning? That it just ends up being as slow as the slowest, participant, and then they bail out Stockport, and then it just seems really slow. Is that the problem with it?
I think I would argue Greater Manchester was never a strategic plan. It might have covered a strategic area, but it's a detailed local plan where they were going to allocate sites and everything. And if anybody's done a local plan jointly with 2 or 3 authorities, to do it with 10 authorities is pretty much impossible. My understanding is that they did that instead of a spatial development strategy because they wanted to change greenbelt boundaries, and you can't do that. Crazily, you can't do that through a spatial development strategy through a combined authority.
Exactly right.
But you're doing just too big a job there. Strategic plans should be high-level investment frameworks. They should be about aligning where you're going to put growth, where you're going to put your housing, and how you're going to align all these different things around infrastructure and everything else. How you're going to align it, and also where you're going to put your money. And that's what the joint strategic plans like West of England, and there's 3 remaining of them, South West Herts, South Essex and Oxfordshire. That's what they're trying to do, is keep a high level an investment framework, which again just does not fit a local plan testing process.
Yeah, I mean, we're talking about a whole series of
good luck to them.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you're talking about a whole series of casualties here. It's not a happy story. One story that is perhaps more positive is the Oxford-Cambridge arc. That seems to be progressing. Now, they have the good sense to take your advice and the scoping of that. And that's been a success story. You were directly involved in scoping the project, as we said on the post. So what are the necessary ingredients to make a strategic plan and a strategic strategy work like it appears to be with that corridor?
Yeah, I mean, I'm really pleased the government are playing this the way I think it should be played. And I think the first issue is that governance, that decision making, and the government has taken that decision that they will be the ultimate arbitrator in this and the ultimate decision maker. And I think that's a good thing. I think it is about having a high level framework, and they're not going to do too much. So that allows them to do it quicker, much quicker. It's not part of the statutory development plan. And I think that's where RSS's regional spatial strategies went wrong. the government put it through a statutory development plan system, and that's why it sort of got caught up in all the machinery that goes with the legislative framework and everything else. Might have been great for the lawyers, but not so good for people that wanted a quick result. And I think that so get the investment right, keep it high level, keep it grounded in sort of what is sensible at that level. Keep it at a sensible geography, and that's a really important point as well. You know, regional planning is a form of strategic planning. Strategic planning happens on different spatial geographies, and actually in history it has always happened in combination at a regional and a more sub-regional scale. They have to work together. And I think with the geography, I always call it the Goldilocks principle. It's got to be big enough to be able to capture national priorities and deliver that sort of interface between the sort of local and national. But it's also got to be local enough to capture what's happening on the ground and the differences that are happening on the ground. And structure plans, people always say, oh, you just want structure plans back. But one of the reasons structure plans worked was the scale of geography it was. You could scale up and deal with big issues. You know, in my case in Surrey, you know, we scaled up because we worked with Serplan to deal with the greater London area, but we could also scale down to focus on areas like Heathrow and growth around Heathrow and things like that. So getting the spatial geography right is really important. And then the final one, I think, is where I hope the framework, the Oxford-Cambridge ARC framework goes, and that's sort of preparing your delivery plan alongside the strategy. So having a high level vision-led framework, but actually having some idea of how you're going to deliver it and who's going to deliver it and where the money's going to come for it, at least for sort of 10 years. And too often, even with local plans, we leave that bit to the end. So when you do get into an examination process, there's questions still around how you're going to do it. And you've got the Highways England and others sitting around the table saying, sorry, it's not one of our priorities, you have to think again.
Who's driving, if you don't mind me asking, who's driving the Oxcam ARC? Where's the driving power behind that project?
There's a debate to be had there, because I think when it was first published by National Infrastructure Commission, it was sold as being a little bit about green growth and the driver of the economy and everything else, and therefore a national priority. But I do think it was much more about housing numbers and actually significantly boosting the housing numbers around London, and taking some of the heat away from the Greenbelt areas immediately around London. And I'm not saying that's not one of government's drivers. I'm sure that is still one of the drivers, but I think the local authorities, because they really proactively engaged with this, most of them, not all of them, I won't mention Buckinghamshire, most of them have engaged proactively and have tried to get the government to move away from it just all about being housing numbers and being about proper spatial planning where they're delivering good growth across the ARC area. So I think the local authorities, all credit to the ones that have been involved so far. You know, they have managed to move the sort of the incentive and the drivers much more away from it all being about 1 million new homes and a shiny new expressway, which is also gone.
I noticed the government moving away from the 1 million homes, but I have to say that did grab attention. You know, it's the first time I've ever seen 1 million homes being talked about. And in that ARC, I think the universities are quite powerful, aren't they? I know that Paul acts for one particular university or college in that area. I've acted for them as well. The universities exert a lot of influence in that area, don't they?
They do, and I believe they're big landowners right across that whole area, which you can't ignore. So they've got a vested interest, but they're also, you know, huge. You know, they have a huge potential in terms of jobs in that area and the right types of jobs that the government wants. So there's an argument around how much that growth across the ARC is really part of the levelling up agenda. You know, the argument is if you get the ARC and the economy right, and for the national economy, that has benefits for the rest of the country. But I think there's still a bit more to play around that, you know, see exactly what that does mean in terms of the spin-offs that the northern part of the country will actually get as a result of this.
I definitely think that ARC is about kind of replicating Silicon Valley and trying to get where all the brains are. You mentioned yesterday more postgrads in Oxfordshire than actual undergrads, which is impressive. All those science parks and so on. Okay, now the slightly controversial. The Tories abolished regional planning to get themselves elected into office in 2010. I remember Caroline Spellman saying, "We're going to abolish them." God bless you. When Conservatives try to promote growth now, as in Oxfordshire, Guildford, Uttlesford, all true blue areas, they find themselves ousted by a coalition of anti-growth parties. Some might say that's poetic justice. But is delivering growth in NIMBY England just too difficult? I mean, is that the problem, really? Some areas go for growth and then suddenly they find all their councillors are gone. I noticed you commenting about the loss of some very progressive councillors in Oxfordshire, for example, at the county council level. I mean, is it just like a catch-22? We just can't do it because this is England.
We've done it so well in the past and we keep forgetting this. And, you know, one thing that I think the government needs to do is just look at how we did it in the past and not try to start again with a clean sheet of paper, because there's some really good and bad examples of the past. And one of the things when localism was introduced, they devolved all the risk, financial risk, political risk, all the risk down to individual local authorities who, you know, it just takes a couple of changes in politicians through elections, and most of them have elections every single year for it all to topple over. So strategic planning and decisions around where growth's going to happen, housing numbers, have worked in the past where there's shared risk, where there's a lot, you know, more than one local authority taking these decisions. And yeah, it requires good leadership. It requires leaders to stick their head above the parapet, and, you know, more often than not, they'll get shot at some point. But having some form of strategic planning and the governance that goes with that puts a barrier up and to sort of protect them to a certain extent. And when Eric Pickle said he's going to famously, you know, I'm going to get rid of this blame game. The blame game worked brilliantly. You know, when we were doing a structure plan in the county, the government dictated the housing numbers, and the county council blamed the government, and then carried on with the structure plan, divvied it up to the 11 districts. The 11 districts blamed the county council, but that whole debate then disappeared, and they managed to then move on and work positively and proactively with the communities to shape that and to make sure that they got the best out of that. So the blame game really worked in strategic planning, because none of the decisions that are being made are easy decisions. They're all really hard political decisions. So you need to have a structure that protects local politicians and allows them to make brave decisions without losing their seat. And, you know, that will never go away. There will always be councillors who do that and who end up losing their seat on a council. But we've seen that far more over the last 10 years than we ever did under a system where we had effective strategic planning.
I couldn't agree with you more. And I have to say, I mean, I don't know why the government is so weak about this, frankly. If you don't take your housing, you're not getting your budget for education. You're not getting your budget for highway improvements. You know, the government could flex their muscles, and these NIMBY parties would be ousted out because they'd end up costing, you know, there'd be an electoral impossibility of having schools closed because they just wouldn't take the houses they should take. Now, the white paper, everybody's interested in the white paper. We're all getting very excited, and it was all going to tell us everything, only it didn't. And the government finally conceded, didn't they, in the white paper, that the duty to cooperate doesn't work, like as if we didn't know that. And they suggested no alternative. So 9 months later, we have the Queen's speech, and no alternative again. Have you heard anything? We're all desperate to know. Have you heard anything? Is there anything that's being talked about by way of an alternative?
I would love to say yes. I really, really, really would. I'm an eternal optimist. I'm hoping that the reason that there's nothing in the Queen's speech about the sort of duty to cooperate or what will replace it is because they're going to go down a non-statutory route, so it doesn't have to appear in legislation. So maybe they're looking at what's happening in the Oxford-Cambridge arc and thinking this might work elsewhere. And the other one is the levelling up white paper, whether there's going to be more in that about strategic planning, although my concern is I'm not sure the same people that are preparing the levelling up white paper talk to the people that prepared the planning reforms. So, you know, you do need that integration again at the national level. So I hope there are really good discussions going on internally within government about what will replace the duty to cooperate, but I haven't heard anything.
Okay. Well, that segues nicely into what I think is the $1 million question that is going to be put to you by Mr. Charles Banner.
Well, the question is there a workable alternative to the duty to cooperate? And if so, what is it?
Yes, there's a workable alternative. And I did some work for the County Council Network as part of the planning response to planning reforms, and Planning Officers Society and some others fully endorsed that, because we used what was already happening out there. We used that again at the sort of the practice over the 10 years to inform it. So the proposal we came up with was that you would have frameworks, investment frameworks, strategic planning frameworks, but integrated frameworks with other things, but they would be not part of the statutory development plan. And our sort of models based on a lot of work that's already happening out there. So government could move quickly with this. You know, they could just say, get on with it. The trick is the decision making, and something would be needed around that. So what we proposed was strategic planning advisory bodies. And there's growth boards, a lot of growth boards and things. So these would be partnership bodies that would comprise the local authorities and, importantly, county councils where they existed, where they were relevant, but also potentially things like local enterprise partnerships and some national transport bodies. And the growth boards would be sort of an advisory body to government on housing numbers, on strategic infrastructure. You know, the government recently asked that question about what do we need to deliver national infrastructure locally. Well, they could play a really good role in that as well. And they would also have a role in terms of the future of the infrastructure fund. You know, one of the problems with infrastructure funding is it goes off all in different directions. There's no alignment in terms of priorities. So actually they could play a really important role in terms of managing the infrastructure funding to make sure that it's being used for the right things on behalf of the whole area. So yes, strategic planning advisory bodies. Now, one of the critical issues there in terms of the legislation is they could operate by Secretary of State saying, tell us who your strategic planning advisory body is, and we'll tick it off and say, right, we'll have advice from you. But they could also put it in legislation and make them a statutory role. But the important thing is they would be a partnership, and that's where we've seen the magic happen. There's some really strong strategic partnerships around, but no matter how strong they are, they still find it really difficult to make decisions about where the housing goes, what the overall housing number should be, and other big questions, because they are a partnership and they're not acting as one single body. So the solution we put forward for the County Council Network is a workable solution. It's a solution that ticks all the government's boxes in terms of what they need, and it could be done quickly. It could be done now if the government had an appetite to move forward, and it would deliver the housing, the local plans and everything else. It would take the heat out of what local planning authorities are. And my goodness, in places like around London and Birmingham, if we could move quickly with a solution, then wouldn't that be good for everyone?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Thank you very much, Charlie. Paul, your question?
Yeah, I'm prepared to take advice from anyone who's got the Human League sitting behind their head, left shoulder. That establishes your credibility in the first instance for me. Yeah, my question, Catriona, is really sort of back to the future. When I started in this game, we had RPGs, regional planning documents, that were about 3 pages long. And they said there shall be growth in this location, there shall be employment growth at this level. And then it was transcended down to strategic level for the dual authorities, 2-tier, and then given to the unitaries. And they had to get on with it. And Paul Watson, one of our viewers, has said strategic plans provide a political excuse for locally unpopular decisions. So I'm expanding that, including RPG. Now, since that time, since 1997, we've had 24 years of incessant reforms by secretaries of state. Is there any good that's come from that, in your view?
Yeah, I mean, I think my favoured model would be the sort of evolution of the one you described. So it would be regional planning guidance in the 90s, which went a little bit further than the sort of high level statements of the 80s, because they set out a lot, they dealt with a lot more complicated issues, and that was needed around some of the big cities. I think the mistake we made was, as I said earlier, going into a statutory system, which RSS did, and it just got a whole load more complicated at that point. But we've just had constant change. You know, regional spatial strategies, you know, they lasted a blink of an eye. They never got a chance. And let's remember, the Labour government reformed them as well in 2008. So they were moving from regional spatial strategies to regional strategies, which combined the spatial strategies, the transport strategies, the economic strategies. So we just kept on getting more and more complicated, and it got more and more bogged down. I also have to say, regional planning is not always the best geography to do good strategic planning. So I would argue going back to something, if you were having some form of regional planning, go back to something much more high level, much more sort of like RPGs, and then have sort of some form of strategic planning at that sort of more local level to deal with some of the issues and how you know, things like spatial distribution, housing numbers, and that's the model that we've tried to sort of put forward in the CCN proposal, but it's also the model that is effectively coming out of the Oxford-Cambridge framework. Hopefully, and we'll see hopefully in the summer what that looks like, but I think that's the way that is going, and it will take us back to a system that is simpler, but will deliver at the end of the day.
That not only is that good advice, but I'm also going to nick the idea of putting these album covers into frame. Right, thank you for both.
Very good. Okay, Mary, your question?
Well, I'd like to say, first of all, it's just as an observation, it's not all doom and gloom. And I'd like to do a shout out for Plymouth City Council and Paul Barnard down there, because after all, Plymouth, South Hams and West Devon did successfully manage to achieve a joint plan. So that's just one sort of observation. My question is about the joint strategic planning, and I'm picking up a little bit on what Chris Poulton, one of our viewers, is suggesting about a new role for counties, or as he describes, joined up counties. So after that run up, this is my question. Should the government be more transparent and explicit in providing national policy and guidance about the potential for joint strategic planning? I mean, you've already outlined some of the difficulties that these other authorities are having trying to squeeze a joint strategic plan into a local plan framework. And is this a potentially collaborative way of working? And therefore the answer potentially for, you know, new towns and settlements. And should it come from the top in the form of a national strategic plan, do you think, or to guide investment or infrastructure? I mean, that's a perennial question that we keep asking. And I'm a bit worried about the fact that the leader of Oxford has lost his seat, because a lot of people in Hertfordshire and Essex, as you know, are watching to see what happens to the Oxfordshire JSP. So does that election result spell, do you think, the end of the Oxfordshire JSP? I rather hope not.
I hope not, mainly because I'm working with them on the joint plan, so I hope it doesn't disappear. I mean, I've been working, there was 5 joint strategic plans, 2 have gone, there's 3 left, and I've been working with all 3 over the last few years, and, you know, so they're trying to what's that, square peg into a round hole, and that, yeah. And we have written, the authorities that have been involved in that, we have written extensive advice to civil servants around how to fix this without having to throw the whole system up in the air. But I think the conclusion we got to was, actually, it's just not going to work. We're trying to do something through a statutory development plan system that is too much for that. Even if we could change the system, let's take it out of that, do something that is high-level frameworks that can be much more flexible and resilient to change and deal with some of the really big issues. And again, back to the issue around governance. I think with the Oxfordshire plan, and, you know, we think about what happened with South Oxfordshire, there was a huge amount of corralling, I suspect, behind behind the scenes with the other local authorities sort of saying to South Oxfordshire, look, you've got to play ball with this. We've worked really hard to get this growth deal. We've worked really hard on the behalf of our residents to do something really positive here. And as a consequence, we have to work together to do a joint strategic plan. That's part of the deal. So you might want to walk away, but you can't, because we all fail if you fail. And I think that is a really important factor. But as opposed to sort of a national plan, I mean, I'm not a big fan of a national spatial plan, because I think there's just, even when we did the South East plan, the variations and the different issues across even one part of the South East are so great. And I'm not sure you can reflect that in a national plan. I think it's, and I also don't think it's fair on anybody that has to prepare that to try and do that. You have no engagement with local communities at that level, apart from anything else, and the issues are just too big. So there's some big issues around national infrastructure that could do with more spatial, something more spatial attached to them, but I'm not a huge fan of national planning. I think there is a spatial geography that works and lends itself to big decisions and things like new communities. There's no reason why at a Surrey level or a Hertfordshire level or a sort of city region level you can't actually do that without a national plan. But the leadership is politicians. Politics is hard, and anybody that goes into a leadership role knows that. Which is why having a governance structure that can put a barrier up and put some protection in there and allow the leaders to make difficult decisions is probably the single most critical issue in getting a strategic planning system right. It's all about the decision making.
Sasha, your question.
Thank you very much, Chris. If Rob is still there, I've just got a surprise for you. Yeah, I want to show you my Bruce Springsteen shirt. That's me on the way to Wembley in 1985.
Who's the guy with the hair?
Excellent.
I'm entirely focused on Sasha, looking very hip and cool.
Sasha, you look so hip.
Yeah, very hip.
I love the aviators as well, Joe Biden.
Yeah. And there's a swagger. There's definitely a swagger.
Yeah. Well, I was on the way to see the boss, so I thought I would.
Amazing.
And he does about, last time I saw him, he did about nearly 4 hours, I think.
Yeah, he's an excellent, you're absolutely right. He's a brilliant live. Yeah, I've seen him several times.
Absolutely right. It was slightly problematical when I got back to my boarding school at 2 a.m, but we'll forget. Now, the question I wanted to ask you was, do you have any information on the white paper? Chris has already touched on it, but do you know, when are we going to see something emerge? We're all on tenterhooks in the light of what the Queen said this week. When are we going to see something actually emerge and we'll know what we're dealing with? Do you know?
Oh, I suspect that's probably a question you want to ask your guest next week, whoever they may be. I think they'll have to respond formally to the white paper. They have to do that, and I'm sure they've finished trawling through their 44,000 responses, all of which I suspect said bring back strategic planning. So it'll be interesting to see what the response is, and I'm not sure we'll see that this time, any time before the summer. And they'll want to squeeze the legislation into the autumn, so maybe August, September is going to look pretty busy. I mean, the white paper was published beginning of August last year.
Yeah.
So we might start seeing something around about late summer in order to give them the sort of the go ahead for the legislation early autumn, if they can fit it in. Other than that, I'm not privy to insider knowledge. It's interesting. Chris Poulton, who asked one of the questions, I should have said, is one of the good strategic planners left in government, but I don't think he's working in planning.
Two ever so quick questions from the audience. Martin asked about the minerals supply running out and the fact we've got. Do you think that's it? I mean, what's the answer there? Without strategic planning at the minerals level, that seems to be, frankly, something that's going very badly wrong.
Well, minerals planning is one of the surviving strategic planning plans. You know, we've still got a whole load of minerals planners working at a strategic level, thankfully, and they still operate at a regional level as well. They've got regional groups where they work with development industry as well. So, you know, that's working really well. Where it's not working so well is the link with the local planning authorities. So things like safeguarding minerals resources, you've got a lot of local planning authorities allocating really valuable sites, mineral sites for housing, and rail interchanges, freight interchanges and all that. So again, particularly in two-tiered areas, that's a really big issue, actually aligning aggregates planning with the planning that's actually proposing where all the housing's going that needs all the aggregates.
And Andy Black asked, is the only way to really solve London's problems regional planning for London and the South East?
Well, if that is Andy Mack as one of my ex-team members, yes, Andy, we need good regional planning back, and you can come back work with me.
Okay, thank you very much indeed, Catriona, and back to you, Charlie.
Thanks, Chris, and thanks hugely from me too, Catriona. Well, that's all we've got for this week. We're going to be back next week, same time, same place. In the meantime, Eid Mubarak to those of our viewers and friends who will be celebrating the end of Ramadan this evening. See you this time next week. Thank you again,
Thanks.
Catriona.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Cheers.